"Sir, please just let me work off the debt." Richard Whitmore III looked up from his poker chips and laughed. "Work it off? A black cleaning lady paying back $15,000? He shook his head. "Your kind can barely count to 10. He stood towering over Denise in her stained uniform. 12 years mopping my floors. 12 years shuffling in here like you belong. You don't." His lip curled. "You smell like bleach and poverty. And that boy of yours in his little ghetto hoodie, he'll end up just like you, serving people like me forever." Executives laughed. Someone pulled out a phone and started live streaming. Security guards watched with folded arms. Not one person moved. A 10-year-old black boy stood frozen, watching his mother be destroyed. But here's what none of them knew. That ghetto kid. He was about to sit at that poker table, and in one hand he would take everything from the richest man in the room. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand two different worlds. The first world sat 63 floors above Manhattan, the Whitmore Capitol penthouse, a palace of leather chairs, crystal decanters, and hand-rolled Cuban cigars. A private poker room with custom mahogany tables and green felt imported from Monaco. On the walls hung photographs of Richard Whitmore III shaking hands with senators, celebrities, and Fortune 500 CEOs. In a glass case near the bar, 3 trophies gleamed under soft lighting. Amateur Poker Circuit Championships, Richard's pride and joy. He'd spent over $50,000 a year on private coaches, flew to Vegas 6 times annually, and never missed a World Series of poker broadcast. He wasn't just rich, he was third-generation rich. His grandfather built the fortune, his father doubled it. Richard, he'd never earned a single dollar in his life. But he'd learned something more valuable: how to make other people feel small. That was his real talent, not poker, not business, cruelty. The second world was 5 Min North, a Harlem apartment on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator, cracked windows that let in winter drafts, radiators that clanked and groaned, but only worked half the time, a kitchen table covered in library books, and a folding chair with duct tape on the seat. The walls were bare, except for one thing: a framed photograph of a man in military uniform holding a deck of cards. This was Preston Foster's world. Preston was 10 years old, small for his age, the kind of small that made bullies think he was an easy target. Quiet in a way that made teachers forget he was in the room. He wore glasses held together with tape and clothes from the Goodwill bin. Always clean, always pressed, because his mother insisted on dignity even when they couldn't afford it. He had his grandfather's eyes, dark, watchful, missing nothing. His mother, Denise Foster, was 42 years old. She'd worked as a cleaning woman at Whitmore Capitol for 12 years. 12 years of night shifts, weekend shifts, holiday shifts, 12 years of scrubbing toilets used by men who earned more in a minute than she made in a month. Her hands were rough. Her back ached constantly. But she never complained. Not once, because every dollar went toward Preston's future. She dreamed of college for him, a scholarship, a way out. What Denise didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her son had already found a way out, just not the kind she expected. 3 years ago, Preston's grandfather, William, had taught him to play cards, not Go Fish, not Old Maid, real poker, Texas Holder, the mathematics of probability, the psychology of reading people, the discipline of controlling your emotions when everything is on the line. William Foster had been a Korean War veteran, a black man from Alabama who'd learned poker in army barracks where white soldiers wouldn't let him sit at their table until they needed a 4th player and couldn't find anyone else. That night, 19-year-old William won 6 months of their wages in a single session. They beat him bloody for it, called him a cheater, broke 2 of his ribs, and split his lip. but they couldn't take back what he'd learned. After the war, William played underground games in Chicago, back rooms, basement clubs, the only places a black man could play for real stakes in 1950s America. He made enough money to buy a house, lost it to a con man who stacked the deck against him. The game was honest, he always told Preston. It was the world that cheated. William died when Preston was 7. Cancer ate him from the inside out. But in those last 3 years of his life, he'd poured everything he knew into his grandson, every trick, every tell, every mathematical formula for calculating odds in real time. And Preston was better than his grandfather had ever been. At 10 years old, Preston could calculate pot odds faster than most adults could add single digits. He could spot a bluff from the twitch of an eyebrow, the rhythm of breathing, the way someone's fingers moved toward their chips. He had what gamblers called the gift, an almost supernatural ability to read people. For the past 2 years he'd been playing online poker under the username Ghost12. No one knew his real identity. No one knew he was a child. All they knew was that Ghost12 had climbed into the top 200 players nationally, beating lawyers, doctors, professional gamblers, and Wall Street traders who had decades more experience. Preston never told his mother. She'd forbidden gambling after watching it consume her father's generation. So he played in secret late at night on a cracked tablet he'd bought for $30 at a pawn shop. He wasn't playing for money. The online sites didn't allow real cash for minors. He was playing for something else. He was keeping a promise. Now, back to the penthouse. Richard Whitmore III stood at the centre of the room, like a king surveying his kingdom. 58 years old, silver hair perfectly styled, a $5,000 suit, a Rolex that cost more than Denise's annual salary. Around him, the usual Saturday night crowd had gathered, junior executives hoping to impress the boss, a few hedge fund managers nursing expensive whizzies, security guards pretending not to watch while watching everything. Eleanor Davis stood near the window, silent as always. 35 years old, sharp-eyed, Richard's executive assistant for 5 years. She'd seen everything, documented everything, said nothing, waiting for the right moment. James Wilson, the weekend security guard, stood by the elevator. 60 years old, a former card player from Detroit who'd run friendly games in his neighborhood before moving to New York. He knew talent when he saw it. He also knew injustice. Vincent Taylor, the building concierge, had already pulled out his phone. 80,000 TikTok followers, a specialty in filming rich people behaving badly. He recognized content when it walked through the door. And tonight, content had arrived. Finally, there was Thomas Whitmore, 28 years old, Richard's only son, weak, quiet, constantly humiliated by his father in front of others. He stood at the bar, nursing a whiskey he didn't want, watching the scene unfold with something like shame burning in his chest. This was the stage. These were the players. And at the centre of it all stood a 10-year-old boy in a second-hand hoodie watching his mother cry. Preston's hand moved to his wrist. To the watch he always wore his grandfather's watch, a cheap Timex that had stopped at 3:42, the exact moment William Foster took his last breath. He'd promised his grandfather he would play. He'd promised he wouldn't hide forever. Tonight, in the most unlikely place against the most arrogant opponent, Preston Foster was about to keep that promise. He just didn't know it yet. Richard Whitmore wasn't finished. He was just getting started. He circled Denise like a shark smelling blood, his eyes bright with cruelty. The broken wine bottle still lay on the floor. A $4,000 Chateau Margaux, its contents spreading across his custom poker, felt like a blood stain. $15,000, Richard said, his voice carrying across the silent room. That's what you owe me. The wine, The felt, emotional distress. Denise's voice cracked. Sir, I don't have, then you're fired. He said it casually like he was ordering coffee. And I'll make sure you never clean another building in Manhattan. How does that sound? Preston watched his mother's shoulders shake. 12 years of service, 12 years of sacrifice, 12 years of swallowing her pride and saying yes, sir, and no, sir, and pretending the comments didn't hurt. Gone in an instant because a rich man wanted to feel powerful. Something stirred in Preston's chest, something hot and sharp, an anger he'd spent his whole life learning to control. Then Richard noticed him, really noticed him. This is your son. Richard walked closer, looking Preston up and down like he was examining something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. The one who's going to make it out of the ghetto. Preston said nothing. His grandfather had taught him that. He doesn't talk much, does he? Richard laughed. Maybe that's smart. Nothing intelligent to say, anyway. Probably gets that from you. The executives chuckled on cue, always on cue. Richard turned back toward the poker table, then stopped. A new idea flickered across his face, the kind of idea that men like him mistake for genius. Actually, Richard said slowly, I'm feeling generous tonight. He gestured to the mahogany table. The green felt the neatly stacked chips. One hand. Texas hold. Your son against me. Denise stepped forward, her body between Richard and Preston. No, absolutely not. Let me finish. Richard held up a hand, his Rolex glinting. If the boy wins, your debt disappears, all 15,000. Plus, you keep your job. I'll even throw in a bonus. Call it compensation for emotion. Forward, her body between Richard and Preston. No, absolutely not. Let me finish. Richard held up a hand, his Rolex glinting. If the boy wins, your debt disappears, all 15,000. Plus, you keep your job. I'll even throw in a bonus. Call it compensation for emotional distress. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. If he loses, you owe me 30,000 and you work for free until it's paid off. Could take years, could take forever. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the executives who laughed at everything Richard said looked uncomfortable. He's 10 years old, Denise whispered. Then this should be quick. Richard sat down at the table, shuffling the deck with practiced hands. Think of it as a life lesson. Some people are born to sit at the table, others are born to clean it. Might as well learn that early. Preston felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The laughing executives, the filming concierge, the silent security guards, they all expected him to cry, to hide behind his mother to prove exactly what Richard Whitmore believed about people who looked like him. But Preston wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the cards. 52 cards, mathematical probability, psychological warfare. The only battlefield in the world where size, age, and money meant nothing. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. The cards don't care about your skin colour, boy. Only about what's in your head and what's in your heart. Preston touched the watch on his wrist. 3:42. Then he walked to the table. Preston, no. Denise reached for him. It's okay, Mom. His voice was quiet but steady. I'll play. Before we see what happened next, you need to understand where Preston learned to play. You need to understand the promise. 3 years earlier, a Harlem apartment, summer heat pressing through windows that didn't close properly. William Foster sat at the kitchen table, a worn deck of cards in his arthritic hands. 75 years old, oxygen tank by his side, a cough that rattled his whole body every few minutes. But when he shuffled those cards, his hands were steady, fluid, like a pianist returning to a beloved instrument after years away. 7-year-old Preston watched, mesmerized. Poker ain't about the cards, William said, dealing 2 hands face down. That's the first thing you need to understand. Most people think it's about luck, about getting good cards. They're wrong. Then what's it about, Grandpa? William smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of hard-won wisdom. It's about the person holding them, their fears, their hopes, their tells. He tapped his temple with one gnarled finger. You learn to read people. You can beat anyone. I don't care if they've got pocket aces and you've got nothing. If you can see inside their head, you win. How do you see inside their head? You watch their eyes. Do they look at their chips when they're strong or when they're weak? Their hands? Do they tremble when they're bluffing or when they're excited? The rhythm of their breath? The way they sit? William leaned forward. People can't help telling the truth, Preston. Their bodies betray them every single time. You just have to learn to listen. Over the next year, William taught Preston everything. Pot odds, the mathematical relationship between the size of the pot and the size of the bet. Implied odds, calculating future value based on how opponents might react. Position play. Why acting last gives you power. Hand ranges. Thinking about all the possible cards an opponent might hold, not just one hand. They used dried beans as chips, a cardboard box as a card protector, the kitchen table as their casino. No fancy equipment, no expensive coaches, just a dying old man and a child who listened with everything he had. But more than techniques, William taught Preston philosophy. Your great-great-grandmother was born into slavery, William said one evening. The sunset painting the kitchen orange through the dirty windows. Couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't own nothing, not even herself. But you know what? They couldn't stop. Preston shook his head. William tapped his temple again. Her mind. Nobody can chain what's in here. Nobody can take it. Nobody can buy it. It's yours. The only thing that's truly yours. He told Preston stories, too, about the army. About the night he won 6 months' wages from white soldiers who thought a black kid from Alabama couldn't possibly understand probability theory. About the beating that followed, and how he'd have done it again in a heartbeat. About the underground games in Chicago, the smoke-filled rooms, the danger of being a black man with money in 1950s America, where success could get you killed faster than failure, about the house he bought, and the con man who stole it with a marked deck and a crooked dealer. The game was honest. William always said it was the world that cheated. But you know what? I'd rather live in an honest game with cheaters than a crooked game where everyone pretends to be fair. One night near the end, William was too weak to sit at the table. Preston sat beside his hospital bed, holding the old man's hand. "I never got to play where it was fair," William whispered, his voice barely audible. No crooked decks, no rigged rooms, just pure cards, pure math, pure skill. He pressed something into Preston's palm. A watch. Cheap. Old. The kind you'd buy at a drugstore 40 years ago. "I taught you everything I know, but you're better than I ever was. You see things I couldn't see." Tears rolled down Preston's cheeks. "Promise me," William said, his voice fading. "When you sit at a table, a real table where it matters, you remember the cards don't lie. People do. Trust the math. Trust your eyes. And never, ever let anyone tell you what you're worth. I promise, Grandpa." William Foster died at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The watch stopped at the exact same moment, and Preston never reset it. Now, 3 years later, that watch sat on Preston's wrist as he faced Richard Whitmore across a poker table. The executives saw a poor kid in a hoodie. Richard saw easy prey. None of them saw what Preston really was, a promise keeper. Richard Whitmore dealt the cards himself, a power move, his way of controlling everything, the deck, the pace, the narrative. 2 cards slid across the felt to Preston, 2 more to Richard. Around them, the penthouse had grown quiet. Even the laughing executive sensed something different. A 10-year-old boy at a high-stakes poker table wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a spectacle, a moment. Vincent Taylor angled his phone for a better shot. His live stream had jumped to 3,000 viewers. Comments scrolled past faster than anyone could read. "Let me explain the rules," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension, "since I'm sure they don't teach Texas Hold in whatever public school you attend." Preston didn't respond. He hadn't looked at his cards yet. Instead, he was watching Richard. The way he sat slightly back in his chair, confident, relaxed. The way he breathed, slow, controlled, but with a slight hitch when he was excited. The micro-expressions flickering across his face, tiny muscles around his eyes that tightened when he felt strong. In poker, these are called tells, unconscious signals that reveal what a player is thinking. Most people can't control them. Most people don't even know they have them. Preston had been reading tells since he was 7 years old. Richard's tells were obvious. Amateur hour. When he was confident, he sat back and spread his arms. When he was nervous, he touched his chips before bedding, a self-soothing gesture. When he was bluffing, his left eye twitched just slightly, just for a moment. Preston catalogued all of this in the first 30 seconds. "You going to look at your cards?" Richard asked. "Or are you too scared?" Preston finally glanced down, lifted the corners of his cards just slightly, a technique his grandfather had taught him, revealing nothing to observers. 7 of spades, 8 of spades, suited connectors. Not a premium hand, not aces or kings or queens. But Preston's grandfather had taught him something crucial. In poker, starting cards are only about 30% of the equation. The other 70% is how you play them. Richard peeked at his own cards. His posture changed immediately, subtle, but Preston caught it. A slight lean back, a tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Richard had a strong hand, probably ace-king, maybe ace-queen. Big cards. That made amateurs feel invincible. The kind of hand that looked great but could crumble against the right opponent. "I'll start us off," Richard said, sliding a stack of chips forward. $5,000. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. $5,000 on the first bet. Before any community cards had even appeared, he was trying to scare Preston out of the hand before it began. Standard bully tactics. Preston had seen it 1,000 times online. He looked at the chips, then at Richard, then back at the chips. Then he pushed his own stack forward. Call. Richard blinked for just a moment, half a second. Surprise flickered in his eyes. He'd expected the boy to fold immediately, to cry, to run to his mother, to confirm every stereotype he believed about people who looked like Preston. Instead, Preston sat perfectly still, his face as blank as a wall. The executive dealing the community cards cleared his throat nervously. The flop. 3 cards landed in the centre of the table. 4 of spades, 5 of diamonds, 6 of spades. Preston's heart rate didn't change. His breathing stayed even. But inside his mind was racing through calculations faster than most computers. He had an open-ended straight draw. Any 3 or any 9 would complete his straight 5 cards in numerical sequence. The board showed 4, 5, 6. His hand held 78. A 3 would give him 3, 4 and a 5, 6, 7. A 9 would give him 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 8 cards in the deck that completed his hand. Plus, he had 2 spades, and there were 2 spades on the board. 9 more spades in the deck could give him a flush. 5 cards of the same suit combined. 15 outs. 15 cards that would make him a winner. Against Richard's ace-king, which had connected with absolutely nothing on this board, Preston was actually the mathematical favourite, but Richard didn't know that. Richard saw a child who should have folded. 8,000, Richard said, pushing more chips forward. His voice was steady, but Preston caught it. The chip touch before the bet. The tell. He's betting big.